Hello again, welcome back as we move now to chapter 10. Well, what happened? Well, you remember that Mr. Rabbit has been taken prisoner on board a pirate ship. We don't know exactly yet what's happened to Mr. Mousey. We know he was knocked out, so let's see if we can find out what happens next as this storm approaches that has the pirates all running about and scurrying about trying to get ready for it. The bang on Mr. Mousey's head was caused by the luggage on board the carpet crashing down on top of him as he landed heavily on the floor of the room in the stern of the ship. The darkness was due to the carpet fluttering down and covering him, which was just as well. For a moment or two he lay quiet and dazed, trying to work out what had happened, which was also just as well. Behind him the window, through which he had just awkwardly corkscrewed, banged shut in the wind, which was just as well as the first two just as wells, if you know what I mean. The thud of the rucksack, satchel and almighty whomp of the mouse falling on the floor had attracted one of the sailors, who had been passing the cabin at that very moment. Immediately suspicious, he stopped and entered the room, looking about warily through his sharp eyes. Since Mr. Mousey was completely covered by the magic carpet, he saw nothing out of place. Still, and since the mouse was dazed and quiet, he heard nothing. Still, pirates are a naturally cautious bunch, so he remained looking suspiciously around. He was about to search the room, which would have had him either tripping over Mr. Mousey or hearing him as he gathered his senses, when the window flew open again and just as suddenly slammed shut with a bang. "Stupid window," muttered the pirate, but without bothering to fasten it, turned and walked away, apparently satisfied enough that he had discovered the source of the sound. Mr. Mousey was only just realizing where he was as the pirate walked off muttering, and for a moment he thought he was discovered. When he heard the footsteps disappearing, however, he quickly realized what had happened and peeked out from below the carpet. Not waiting for another sailor to come by, he hurriedly got to his feet and gathered his things. The room he found himself in was some kind of a map room. In the centre, a large rectangular table was covered in charts, and on one wall, deep recesses in the oak panelling like pigeonholes were filled with many more, all rolled up. Around the table were a number of high-backed, solid-looking chairs, and in the corner, with the sheets folded at the bottom, was a wooden bunk. Beside it was a tall wardrobe built into the wall. The cabin had two windows looking out to sea, and when Mr. Mousey glanced out, he was surprised to see how much rougher that sea had become in even the last few minutes. The waves all now had white foaming tops, and the sky behind churned in shades of black. Rain was coming down in sheets, and some was blowing in through the slamming window. Well, first things first, thought the mouse to himself, and he rolled up the carpet and pushed it deep into one of the map storage shelves at the very bottom, close to the floor. There were a couple of charts already in it, so he managed to hide the carpet by rearranging these around the carpet. Opening the wardrobe, he saw that whoever it was, well, tidiness wasn't a big deal with them. Clothes were hanging in rough fashion all around, and at the bottom some blankets lay in a crumpled heap. It was a simple matter of stashing the rucksacks behind the blankets after first putting the satchel with the book back into its own pack. With everything hid as well as he could, he went to the window and secured it shut. The noise from the sea was now blanked out considerably, and he heard now a new noise. It was the sound of voices shouting to be heard above an ever-increasing howl of wind. Going to the door, Mr. Mousey checked the passageway outside before leaving the cabin in search of his friend. His mind was set in grim determination. He only hoped he wasn't too late to find and rescue Mr. Rabbit. After all, he thought to himself, If this is a pirate ship, dear knows what they could be doing to him. Well, with that thought spurring him on, he crept as quietly as a mouse along the dark passageway. Well, in fact, being a mouse, Mr Mousey did everything like one, so he crept exactly as a mouse, not just like a mouse. There were a number of other cabins off the passageway, and he gently pushed back the doors to each as he passed. All were empty and totally rabbit-free. The ship was rolling about in a most dramatic way, and if it hadn't been that his mind was completely taken up with finding his friend, he might have had time to worry about this. As it was, he slipped about stealthily and came to two sets of steps, one leading down, the other going up. To one side of the stairs was a doorway. From the growl of the wind outside, he guessed it must be leading out onto the main deck. He decided to descend the steps and found that they led down to another passageway. The rooms off this passageway were without doors, and peering through the gloom, he could see by the barrels and sacks that he must be in the stores area of the ship. The ship was swaying and jerking about, and through the hull he could hear the crashing of a furious sea on the wooden hull. Making his way further along, he staggered like a drunk man, trying to prevent himself from being thrown about like a rag doll in the tossing bowels of the vessel. He reckoned himself to be somewhere below the main deck. Above him were sounds that could well have been a full-scale war in progress. Loud screams and shouting mixed with howls of wind in the rigging and thumps and bangs as feet above ran about on the wooden deck. The swaying of the ship was worsening, and Mr Mousey struggled as he searched all the nooks and crannies he came across. Since whatever was going on above seemed to be taking all the sailors, he risked calling out, "Mr Rabbit!" he called in a loud whisper. "Mr Rabbit! It's me, Mr Mousey! Where are you?" There was no response. "Mr Rabbit! Are you here?" No answer. A massive pole was in front of him, coming down through the ceiling, and the creaks and groans that came from it were dreadful. He realised that it was one of the main masts. He had never really thought about it before, but saw now that the masts of a ship must continue right on down to the bottom of the ship. Another set of steps led down, and so he fought his way deeper into the vessel, calling out as he went, "Mr Rabbit! Mr Rabbit! It's me, Mr Mousey!" It was very dark indeed, and although he could no longer hear the cries of the sailors, the creaking and grinding noises were much worse. The crashing of the sea outside could be as much felt as heard, and for the first time he began to fear not only for Mr Rabbit's safety, but also for his own. "If this thing sinks and me down here, I'll never get up in time," he thought aloud. Groping his way along, he passed two more of the mast bases, and he came to a wooden wall. It had a strong door, and finding it unlocked, Mr Mousey made his way through, grabbing the door frame for support. He now saw in the gloom that he was in another part of the ship, probably near the bow, and off the passageway were a number of doors. He began to try them. Meanwhile, up above, the pirates were having a very bad time indeed. The captain had ordered everyone topside to emergency stations. A storm, the like of which most of them had never seen before, had caught them by surprise, and worse, it had come at them from the stern. At the time the storm had hit, all the sails were hoisted, and so sudden was the weather upon them that the captain had too little warning to get them furled up. Well, this was important, since in a sailing ship a violent wind would shred the canvas at best, and at worst blow the vessel into the water and overturn her. Now the captain was a good seaman, and had attempted to get his crew to pull in all the canvas before he brought the ship about to face the storm. Bringing the bow around to face the wind was the only way to fight a storm at sea, but attempting to do so with the main sails spread was suicide. The wind would simply capsize the ship when her beams came about and became exposed to the full power of the raging torrents of wind and water. The pirate ship, bore 3 masts, and each, when fully set, carried at least 3 sails. A long pole projected forward from the front of the ship, called a jib boom, and attached to this and to the front, or foremast, 3 small triangular sails flew. The captain's plan had been to furl all of the canvas, furl means to roll it up, except for these smaller sails, and use these to bring the ship about. This plan was in trouble. Bringing down sails is a very difficult and dangerous job, even in good weather. Sailors must climb the rigging and make their way out along the yard arms, which are the long horizontal poles forming a cross on the masts above each sail. Once there, they begin to pull up the sheets. It's a job that demands good timing and teamwork. Up to 6 sailors can be detailed to furl the main sail alone, and if it is not done all together and at the right speed, a sailor can easily lose his balance and fall, maybe into the sea, or maybe onto the hard oak deck. Surviving either would be unlikely. Believe it or not, very few sailors learn how to swim. Some captains actually prefer it this way, since a man who can't keep himself up in the water will make double sure that the ship he's sailing on will be ship-shape enough to keep him out of it. The view from the deck was a fearful sight at that moment to even the most hardened sailor. The sea all around was a cauldron of boiling foam. The wind had screamed to an unbelievable pitch and was cutting the very tops off the waves, sending thousands of gallons of water horizontally through the air at just about wave height. Higher up, sheets of rain came down like a mighty waterfall, crashing down onto the deck in bursts that threatened to wash away any unguarded sailor off into the steaming depths. All the time, the howling, deafening wind ripped and tore through the rigging. Speech was impossible, and even shouting in each other's ears was difficult to make out. The captain had to approach each of his crew to shout out commands, having to repeat himself to make sure he was understood, and all the time fighting his way through the wind, soaked to the bone. The sailors groaned with effort, pulled at lines and ropes, and with grim determination battled against the storm. Muscles were sore with exertion, and deadly fatigue began to cripple their bodies. The work, however, was so urgent, their condition so life-threatening, that none slacked. Although no one had time to think about it, it was clear that the storm was not abating, but rather increasing in fury all the time. "A hurricane!" the rat captain growled through clenched teeth to no one in particular. "How did I miss the signs?" Up on the yards, crew had managed to bring in the majority of sail. The smaller sheets higher up the masts were the last to need furled, but it looked like an impossible job. No one even thought about the fact that, impossible or no, if they were to have any hope of survival, they had to be brought in. Suddenly an ear-splitting explosion rent the air. There was a blinding flash of blue light, and a bolt of ragged lightning struck the main mast. 2 sailors who were about a third of the way up were sent spinning into the air, and miraculously both landed on the large box of stowed sails on the main deck. Before anyone had time to wonder at this or to rush for help, a loud crack ruptured the darkened air, and a jumble of yard arms, and sails crashed, tossing into the blackening sea. A tangle of ropes connected to the ruined sails and strung out over the sides of the ship. "To the bulwarks!" shouted the captain at the top of his voice to those near him. "Cut the ropes, or we'll be pulled under by the sea!" The ship was already yawing over at a frightening angle as a number of cutlasses and knives hacked at the entangling lines. As the last line was severed, there was a sudden lurch as the ship righted herself. Another battle won, but the war was looking to be in favour of the Hurricane. High up in the mainsail, now with no ropes to climb to get there, the topmost sail swung about crazily in the wind. What went unsaid by all, but understood without doubt, was that with that sail remaining up there, there was no way they could turn into the wind. And if they couldn't turn, no one was going to survive the storm. The ship was going to sink. Down below in his prison, Mr. Rabbit was in more or less total darkness. The one little porthole that looked out to sea now opened out onto a frothing blackness of lashing wind and water. He found himself being thrown about in the gloom, terrified and helpless in his fear. He could tell from the awful pitching and tossing and from the frightful groans from the timber hull that the ship couldn't take too much more of this. At times the dreadful noises from the vessel and the cries from the wind sounded almost like insane voices. It was hard to take in how badly things had turned out so suddenly. He found himself thinking of the face of his pal and remembering the times they had had. Somehow even the memory of the wolves seemed not so bad. The falling off the carpet just before being rescued by Kerouac as only a bit of excitement. "Oh, Mr Mousey!" he cried aloud. "I've ruined everything! This is so awful!" Just then, as the groaning took on an even more voice-like quality, making him shiver all the way down his spine with the ghostly sound, to block it out, he folded his ears down over his head and shut his eyes tight. "Go away!" he screamed to the wind. "Why don't you just get on with it and stop messing about? Sink the stupid boat and get it over with." Not that he actually meant it, of course, but he was angry with the whole thing now, as well as frightened. And being cross usually made him feel a little less terrified. A very little less in this case. The wind and groaning didn't listen one bit. In fact, the noises even began to sound like an actual series of words. "Arr! Arr! Yea! Buzz off!" cried the rabbit. "Can you hear me?" "Oh, very clever," shouted Mr. Rabbit. "Next, you'll know my name." Just why he was talking to the noises didn't cross Mr. Rabbit's head. He just wanted the ghastly things to at least sound like an ordinary, decent, screaming hurricane. "Mr. Rabbit!" Oh, very funny indeed. "Well, I'm not scared. Go away!" he shouted at the top of his rabbity voice. "I'm not here!" This was all getting very weird. Just then a tremendous banging came from the direction of where he supposed the door to be. The bangs increased in severity and volume, and then came a splintering and a cracking. Mr. Rabbit prepared himself for the breaking up of the ship and awaited the seawater bursting through the smashing door. Just then, the door abruptly crashed open, and a small, darting shape bore down on him, sword in hand. "Ah! Murder! I'm being killed!" he screamed in terror. The shape was upon him in a flash, and before he could defend himself, he found himself being flung to the floor with a cutlass, missing his head by inches and embedding itself in the timber. Something warm and solid grappled with his flailing arms, and as he drew in breath to let out another scream, a familiar voice said, "Mr. Rabbit, stop rolling about, it's me, Mr. Mousey." Mr. Rabbit was too shocked at first to say anything. Above him a little face peered down into his own. there was just enough light to make out the undeniable features of Mr Mousey. But, Mr Mousey, how did you... When did you... Well, he paused. Why did you just try to chop my head off? It was hard to say whether he was shocked with delight, wonder or confusion. The cutlass still wobbled, stuck into the floorboards at its point. I heard you shouting in the cabin, and I thought you were being attacked. When I burst in, I lost my balance. Sorry, replied his friend. Just then the ship gave another tremendous lurch. Come on, cried Mr Mousey, picking himself up and helping up Mr Rabbit, who still lay on his back on the floor. We don't have much time. I think the ship is going to sink. Following his pal out through the open door, Mr Rabbit stopped behind the mouse as he reached out to a bracket on the wall. Here, take this. You may need it. The bracket held several nasty-looking weapons and was where Mr Mousey had got the cutlass that he had used to smash in the door. Mr Mousey had already retrieved it from the cabin floor and held it in his right hand. I don't think that I want this, maybe. He didn't get the sentence finished. Once again his pal jumped on him and pushed him to the ground. Hey, now this is a bit much. Once was bad enough, but... An almighty crash interrupted his words. Are you okay? Asked Mr Mousey. That was our way out, collapsing, nearly falling, nearly knocked your head off. Sure enough, the way out was now blocked with twisted timber brought crashing down through the decks by the raging storm. Come on. We can't go back the way I came now. We'll have to find another way out. When Nogger brought me down, we came the other direction, suggested Mr Rabbit. Nogger? Questioned the mouse. One of the pirates. He locked me up, you know. Oh, can you remember the way? I think so, though it was a lot brighter then, you know. They turned and now Mr Rabbit led the way back along the juddering passageway. Now, had you or I been trying to find our way out in this situation, I very much doubt if this story would have got much further. We are, however, dealing with two small animals used to spending a good bit of their lives underground in dark passages and confined spaces, not too unlike the insides of a ship. Coming to stairs, Mr Rabbit led the way up until he stopped at a door. By the roars and crashes coming from outside, from the other side, Mr Mousey realised that the other side was outside. What now, Mr Mousey? Came the troubled words from Mr Rabbit. Do we go out or what? Now, Mr Mousey's original plan had only been to return to the room at the back of the ship where he had left the carpet. Much farther than that he hadn't really had time to work out. Now, when the way back was blocked, when the way back had become blocked, the next thing to do was simply to go back by another route. That this route would mean going onto the deck and fighting the weather, plus 20 or 30 bloodthirsty pirates. Well, that really wasn't something that had become a solid thought in his head. It was a pretty solid one now. It stood up starkly in front of his mind as if to say, hello, I'm a piece of information you should know about. Did you know that basically the odds of you getting out of this one are about the same as a duck winning an arm wrestle with a gorilla? It was quite a daunting fact. Mr Mousey put his hand to the latch on the door. He had to shout to make himself heard. Ready! When I say go, follow me. Just keep your head down and run. We'll try to get to the back of the ship while the sailors are busy with the storm. He waited a few seconds and suddenly threw the door open. Come on, run! As the two burst out of the doorway, a fearful scene confronted them. The first sensation was the unbelievable violence of the wind. It immediately ripped the breath from their open mouths and screamed with a deafening roar into their ears. Above them a tumbling black sky flashed with great bolts of lightning fizzling through the air. Sodden and frantic sailors swarmed over rigging, pulling at ropes, grappling at beams and booms. Beyond the vessel, no line between sea and sky could be seen. The sea seemed to be exploding upwards into the hurricane above, and sheets of water came at them from every imaginable direction. The two were almost blown back into the doorway and had to press forward with all of their might just to get to the foremast, only 10 feet away. Here Mr. Rabbit looked to the stern and caught sight of the rat captain and another sailor clutching at the ship's wheel, apparently fighting a lost battle. Mr. Mousey had seen something else. It was fear. This was the first time, remember, that Mr. Mousey had seen any of the pirates. At any other time he would have seen what he might have expected: rough, tough, sword-wielding seamen looking threatening and dangerous. What he saw now was quite different. Two pirates nearby were struggling with a wooden hatch which was being ripped off its hinges by the wind. They were trying to fasten it down with ropes, and every time they seemed to have it fastened down, the next gust would wrench it back off. They looked rough and tough right enough, but a long way from threatening and dangerous. Fear poured from their anxious faces, and their movements appeared to become more and more desperate. To his left, over at the ship's side, others seemed to be trying to cover gaps in the low wall, called the bulwarks, to cover them with boards, trying to stem the great washes of water flooding onto the deck. He and Mr. Rabbit were at the first mast of the ship, holding on for dear life, as at the next mast, a small group of sailors were pulling madly at ropes that stretched upwards into the blackness. When his eyes followed the ropes up, he saw what they were trying to do. The one last sail on the mainmast fluttered wildly, and they were trying desperately to pull it down. That they were not going to manage it was quite clear. All this Mr. Mousey saw and understood in a few seconds. Something had to be done. "Stay here!" he shouted into his friend's ear. Before Mr. Rabbit had time to say anything back, Mr. Mousey pressed forward into the wind towards the mainmast. Now, one of the sailors pulling on the ropes suddenly became aware of what he thought was another sailor leaning on his shoulder. He was turning to see who had come to help when he realised he was not being leaned on, he was being stood on. "What are you—" He never finished the sentence as a small mouse leapfrogged off his back, over his head, landed on the rope dangling in front of him, and began climbing up towards the mainmast, up towards the masthead. Another of the group shouted out, "Who's that? What's he doing?" Mr. Mousey was always good at climbing, and already he was a third of the way up the rope. Now if the wind was powerful at deck level, up here it was a screaming tornado. Lengths of broken yard arms swung about crazily, threatening to knock him off the rope. Up he went, higher, higher. Below, faces began to turn from their tasks as the climbing mouse was spotted by other sailors. At the wheel, the captain was fighting with the vessel, trying to keep the wheel from turning onto the wind, trying to prevent the vessel from going broadside on, which would have been the end altogether, when he saw the action on the centre mast. "What? That's madness! He'll be blown off and killed for sure," he shouted to the sailor helping him. Inside, of course, he admired the display of bravery and wondered which one of his crew it might be. It was the captain who first realised what the tiny creature, the tiny figure now at the top of the mainmast, was attempting to do. With one arm wrapped around the top of the mast, he was chopping away at the lines holding the top sail, called the royal, to the mast. That he had managed to hold on this long was a miracle in itself. It would be certainly a major miracle if he succeeded. Mr. Rabbit, meanwhile, stared on in shock and unbelief. The horrors only seemed to get worse. From thinking he was going to die in the cabin to thinking he was going to perish instead by angry pirates along with angry pirates in the hurricane, he now saw he was going to live to see the horror of seeing his best friend die before they were all drowned. "What are you doing?" he called helplessly into the storm. "You'll end up dead and drowned," he shouted. "Well, at least no one can say I didn't tell him drowning was dangerous," he thought. Mr Mousey wasn't hearing any of this, of course. In fact, all he could hear was the screaming wail of wind, furious at this small creature defying its best efforts to dislodge him from the mast. The buffeting was like being in a boxing ring with 10 heavyweight champions of the world, all having a go at him at the same time. He hacked away with all his strength at the entangling ropes, missing entirely in many of his slashes, and almost overbalancing and falling when he did so. If Mr Mousey had a strongest virtue, however, it was this: determination. He knew, of course, that he might fail. Possibly would fail, in fact. But he didn't entertain the notion that he actually would. Gripping the cutlass firmly in his hand, he swung again and again. The cutlass, however, was heavy, and the physical exertion of just holding on was beginning to tell. He was weakening. And the pirates below could see it. For a moment, some of them had even begun to hope that the stranger above was going to manage to chop down the offending sail, that they'd be able to get the ship around after all. But now the stranger above them was tiring, and now it was only a matter of time. Well, even determination has its limits, and the mouse was getting near to his. Although he had severed 3 of the tangled lines, 2 more remained, and Mr Mousey was holding on to the mast now with both arms, the cutlass feeling like a dead weight in his right hand. Suddenly, floating above the howls of the wind, he heard another sound, the sound of voices cheering. "You can do it! Hurrah! 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 You can do it!" The voices were joined by others, and soon the whole deck resounded with the cries of the crew. Everyone was cheering the mouse on. The motley pirate crew, old Nogger, the rabbit, the captain himself. "Hurrah! Hurrah! Hurrah! Come on, you can do it! You can do it!" Like an extra injection of energy, the calls gave Mr Mousey a boost. At that precise moment, the wind seemed to drop for a second, as if inhaling for the mightiest blow of all. In that second, he lunged at the last ropes, and in a single slash, severed them both. The billowing sail disappeared off into the boiling sea, and seeing the window of opportunity, the captain wasted no time in seizing it. "Now, Hasher! Hard to starboard with all thy might!" They turned the wheel with all their strength, and slowly the ship responded. Coming around, she was now at the mercy of the full force of the hurricane. Untold thousands upon thousands of gallons of water, seawater, hurled against the side of the ship as she slowly turned to the right. The wind ripped into every possible place, and sailors threw themselves down and held on for dear life. At the foremast, Mr Rabbit found himself lying flat on the deck, his arms wrapped around the mast, being thrown about in a most frightening way. The ship, now having her starboard side totally exposed to the full fury of the sea, began to keel over at a steeper and steeper angle. On the deck, the sailors found themselves clinging on to a surface getting near vertical. If the ship didn't complete the turnaround in the next minute, it was certain that in everyone's mind that she would tip over altogether and sink. Meanwhile, Mr Mousey had no way down from the masthead. The sail, in flying off, also took away the last of the lines and rigging that was attached to it, and there was nothing but a slippery mast to hold on to. As the ship turned, he found himself looking down on a dark, churning mass of angry sea, and seeing how dangerous his situation, he tried to find some way from falling. Lashing his belt through a steel eyelet in the mast, he refastened it around his middle, now firmly tied to the wood. The risk in this was that if the ship did go over, he would have no escape at all. Not that anyone could have survived in a sea like this in any case. Suddenly he saw from the corner of his eye a massive shape looming off to his right. Looking up, he nearly cried out when he saw bearing down on them a wave of immense proportions. It was half as tall as the ship itself, and as it advanced, foam and streaks of black covered its rearing surface. Behind him he felt something bang against his shoulder, which had made him turn just in time to see a broken, swinging piece of timber come straight at him. The last thing he remembered was the moment of impact. Then once again, all was blackness. What next? Well, that was a long chapter, wasn't it? We'll stop there because I'm sure you're tired, but we need to find out what happens next, and that'll be chapter 11. So you know where to look on YouTube and find the next chapter. I hope you enjoyed that. I hope I haven't got you too excited or too worried. Don't be too worried. Now you take care and look after yourselves and your family, and God bless. I will see you again next time. Bye bye.